What is your name, and why were you called it? Do you like your name? Or would you rather have been called something different? Names go in cycles of popularity, don't they? Today's most popular names for newborns are Olivia and Amelia for girls, and Noah and Oliver for boys. But when I was at school, there were no one with those names in my classes. When I was born in 1974, Paul was the number one most popular boy's name. Now it's not even in the top 100. Names go in and out of fashion, don't they, over time? But we're going to talk today about a name that you may never even have heard of, but which is one of the most important names ever. It is the name of God himself. You see, we usually refer to God as God. But in the Bible, God's name is not God. Let me explain. In the Old Testament, God has a name, and it's written like this in ancient Hebrew: YHWH. Now, how do you say a word that is spelt like that? You can't, because it has no vowels. Back in the day when the ancient Hebrews wrote this word down, they were writing on stone or on wood. And so they kept things simple and didn't bother writing the vowels to save space, basically. And they knew what the vowels were, so they didn't need to. They simply wrote YHWH. So scholars have had to guess how to pronounce this word. And nearly all scholars think that it's pronounced like this: Yahweh. And in the Old Testament, God's name is not God, it is Yahweh. It's all over the Old Testament. Let me give you some examples. Psalm 23 begins, "The Lord is my shepherd, you will know it well." But actually what the Hebrew says is, "Yahweh is my shepherd." Or Psalm 95, "O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." But in the original Hebrew, it is, "O come, let us sing to Yahweh. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." Can you see? Yahweh is God's name. One of the most important verses in the whole of the Old Testament is Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." But in Hebrew, this is actually, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." Near the start of the book of Exodus, Moses meets God in a burning bush. God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh to bring the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Moses thinks this is a very bad idea for Moses and says to God, "Look, if I do this, if I go to Egypt and they ask me who has sent me, what should I say? What is your name?" And God famously says to Moses, "I am who I am. Thus you shall say, I am has sent me to you." So when God tells Moses his name, he says, "My name is I am." But when the Israelites say God's name, they say, "He is." And "He is," in Hebrew, is Yahweh. So the God of the Bible has a name. His name is Yahweh. He is. Now, although Yahweh is written all over the Old Testament as God's name, over time the Israelites stopped saying this name at all. One of the 10 Commandments was, "You shall not misuse the name of Yahweh your God." And they were so concerned about breaking this commandment, about not misusing God's name, that they stopped saying it altogether. And instead, when they read the Old Testament out loud, they just said the name. Or they replaced Yahweh with Adonai, which means Lord. When the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek 200 years before Jesus, every time the word Yahweh came along, they replaced it with Lord, because God's name was too holy to say. And that's why in English Bibles we do the same, essentially. When you see Lord written in capital letters in the Old Testament, that's your sign that the Hebrew word there is not Lord, it's God's name. It's Yahweh. So the Lord is my shepherd is actually Yahweh is my shepherd, and so on. I wonder if we need to get back to calling God by his actual name. For 2 reasons. Firstly, using God's name reminds us that God is a person. I don't mean that he is male or female or even human. I mean that God is a relational being. Yahweh is not a force or an object or a thing. Yahweh, God, is a person. Calling him Lord is like a title. It's like calling someone judge or prime minister or doctor or vicar. If I refer to Becca as the wife, that tells you the position she occupies in relation to me. But she is far more than that, isn't she? She is a person in her own right. So if we call God Lord, it's a title. But there is so much more that can be known about him. He is a person. He is Yahweh. He can be known. He has a name that is his. Secondly, I think using God's name makes it clear who it is that we are worshipping. You see, throughout history, there have been many gods that people have worshipped. In the Old Testament, there was Baal and Asherah and all the rest. At the time of Jesus, there was Zeus and Artemis and all the Greek and the Roman gods. More recently, there is Woden and Thor and Saturn. The origins of the names of some of the days of the week. And even today there are many gods. There are the gods of Hinduism, Vishnu and Shiva and the like, and the god of Sikhism, and Allah in Islam. There have been and are many gods that humans have worshipped. But we don't worship any of those. We worship Yahweh, the God who called the people of Israel and who sent Jesus. Jesus himself thought that he was Yahweh come in person. In our gospel reading that we just heard, Jesus stands looking over Jerusalem and weeps, cries over a city that he knows is going to reject him. Because you did not recognize the day of your visitation from God. That was then. Here was Yahweh come in person, but many did not accept him. Earlier on, I told you that the Jews stopped saying Yahweh and replaced it with Lord. In Hebrew, that is Adonai, and in Greek, it's Kyrios. The Kyrios is my shepherd. Hear, O Israel, the Kyrios is our God, the Kyrios alone. You shall love the Kyrios your God with all your heart, your soul and your might. So Kyrios is how the Jews at the time of Jesus referred to Yahweh. But very quickly, Kyrios is what the early Christians also called Jesus. Philippians 2, at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Kyrios, Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The words that they used to describe Yahweh in the Old Testament, they now use to describe Jesus in the New. So using God's name, Yahweh, reminds us that God is a person and reminds us exactly who it is that we worship. We don't worship any of the other possible gods. We worship Yahweh. But what is Yahweh like? What kind of God is it that we worship? Our reading from Exodus 34 tells us. And you won't be surprised to know that every time it says Lord, it's actually Yahweh. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty. Remember, this is in the Old Testament. And many of us have a vision of God in the Old Testament. A picture of God as a God who is powerful and scary and full of anger and wrath. But when Yahweh wants to tell us what he is like, that's not what he says in these verses. Yahweh is merciful and gracious. Mercy and grace is what he does. Or listen to these famous words from Psalm 103. As a father has compassion on his children, so Yahweh has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows of what we are made. He remembers that we are but dust. Or these verses from Psalm 145. Yahweh is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. All this, some of my favourite verses from Isaiah chapter 40. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Yahweh is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will be faint and weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for Yahweh will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This is God, the God we worship, the God whose name is Yahweh, the creator of the universe who comes to us in Jesus and by his Spirit. Will you worship him alone today? Will you love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might? Will you build your life around him? Will you serve him above all others? Because he is merciful and gracious, because he created you and loves you. His name is Yahweh. He is.